When Polina moved into an old apartment in the city center, she expected quiet and cozy. The house, though old, looked solid: high ceilings, large windows, solid wooden floorboards. The apartment had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away a few months ago. "The house is great," the realtor said as he showed her the apartment, "but you know, it holds its own history." Polina paid no attention to his words. She was busy packing and thinking about her new life. In the evening, Pauline laid out her things and decided to rest a little. Her attention was drawn to an antique chessboard left by her grandmother on the mantelpiece. She remembered her grandmother telling her as a child that the chessboards had once belonged to her grandfather, who had been a master of the game. "It's a good thing they were preserved," she thought, stroking the dusty wooden case. As night fell, the house became silent, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards. Pauline didn't pay much attention to it, writing it off to the age of the house. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Pauline woke up. She was awakened by a sound, a long creak, as if someone was slowly walking on the floor. Probably the neighbors, she thought, pulling the blanket higher. But the sound continued. The footsteps moved from one side of the apartment to the other, stopped, and then started again. Pauline got up, took the flashlight, and went out into the hallway. The floorboards creaked quietly under her feet. "Is there someone here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice firm. The answer was silence. She looked all around the apartment, but found no one. When she returned to the bedroom, Pauline noticed that the chessboard was now open, and several pieces were still in place, although she remembered the lid being closed. "I must not have noticed," she whispered, feeling her heart beat harder. The next evening, Pauline heard footsteps again, but now they were louder. They started in one room, moved to another, and finally stopped in front of her bedroom door. She froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. Suddenly the door creaked open slowly. In the darkness of the hallway, she saw a vague figure, a shadow, standing and staring at her. "Who are you?" Pauline shouted, but the figure silently disappeared as if it had never been there. Pauline thought it was just her imagination, but when she went to the chessboard, she saw that the pieces had moved again. The board was now arranged as if a new game had begun. Her hand involuntarily reached for the king, but before she could touch it, there was a whisper in the room. "The move is yours." Pauline froze. The whisper was barely audible, but it definitely came from the empty room. She jerked her hand away from the chess piece, feeling the coldness envelop her fingers. "It's some kind of prank," Pauline tried to convince herself, even though she knew she was alone in the apartment. She closed the chessboard, pulling the lid tight, and put it away in the closet. "It's better this way," she said aloud, to relieve some of the tension. But the night brought new strangeness. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Pauline woke up again. She was awakened by the same creakings of the floorboards. This time the sound was clearer, as if someone was slowly pacing from room to room. She turned on the light, grabbed her phone, and opened the recording app to capture the noise. The sound of footsteps died down outside her bedroom, and suddenly the door slowly began to open. Pauline held her breath, trying to convince herself it was a draft. But then she saw it. On the floor, just in front of the door, lay a chess piece, a black knight. "It can't be," she whispered, freezing in place. The footsteps resumed, but now they were moving toward the closet where she had hidden the board. Pauline walked over to the cabinet, her hands trembling. She knew she had to check the board. She opened the doors. The chessboard was back where it belonged, but the lid was ajar. The pieces were arranged on the board, and on square D5 lay a black queen. "Who is doing this?" she exclaimed, feeling her voice breaking. There was no reply, but a cold wind ran through the room. This time Pauline made up her mind. She took the white king and made a move. As soon as she placed the piece, there was a low, rumbling sound in the room, like someone sighing. The pieces on the board began to move on their own. The black queen stepped forward. Polina recoiled, almost dropping the board, but she couldn't take her eyes off it. "The game is just beginning," whispered a voice from the darkness. Polina remembered the words of her grandmother, whom she had always thought strange. She often talked about chess, which supposedly could be connected with something mystical. "This board is too old," her grandmother used to say. "It remembers more than it needs to." Polina realized that the board was more than just a family heirloom. It was something more. She glanced again at the figures that had frozen in their places. Taking a deep breath, she realized that now she would have to finish the game. But with each new move, The footsteps in the apartment grew louder and the shadows in the corners of the room grew longer. Pauline sat across the chessboard, her heart beating so hard that it seemed to overpower the creaking of the floorboards. She made her next move, moving the white rook. The pieces moved themselves again, and the black queen was in a threatening position. "Who's playing with me?" Pauline asked, her voice trembling. The answer was a whisper coming from everywhere. "The game requires attention and sacrifice." At that moment, she noticed that it was getting darker around her. The lights in the room were fading, and shadows began to slowly creep up to her chair. Pauline remembered her grandmother's words about the blackboard remembering more than it should. She jumped up and ran to the closet where the old papers lay. She found her grandmother's notes where she had mentioned strange dreams and footsteps she had heard in the night too. On one of the pages it said, "This board is not just a toy, it is connected to something ancient. Each move brings the player closer to the truth, but only a completed game frees or destroys." Pauline felt her palms become covered with sweat. She glanced at the board. The pieces froze, waiting for her next move. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered, trying to figure out how to get out of this trap. And then the shadows began to move. One of them separated from the wall and took the shape of a man. It was a tall man in ancient clothes, his eyes glowing with a cold light. "You're already in the game," he said, "and there is only one way out, to finish the game." Pauline realized that there was no way out. She made another move, moving the king. The man watched silently as the Black Knight made a move of its own, finding itself in a threatening position. "Why are you forcing me to play?" she asked. "Because every move is a step toward the truth, and the truth is what you fear most." Shadows began to fill the room, and Pauline felt the cold stiffen her legs. The man raised his hand, and the chessboard lit up. Pauline saw pictures of the past. A man sitting at the same board, but there is no one across from him. His moves seem to be fighting with themselves. Then the pieces come to life and he makes a final move, after which his body dissolves into shadow. Were you playing?" Pauline asked. The man nodded. "I lost, and now I'm here to finish what I started, but I won't be the one making the final move." Pauline looked at the board. The pieces were in a decisive position, and she had a fateful choice to make. "You will either win or take my place," the man said. Pauline raised her hand, realizing that everything depended on her next move. Pauline could hardly catch her breath. The room had become unbearably cold, and the light seemed to have completely disappeared, leaving only a dim glow emanating from the chessboard. The man in the ancient clothes stood motionless, his gaze seeming to press down on her. "You are approaching the finals," he said, his voice sounding like an echo in the void. "But remember, every move is a choice, and not always victory brings freedom." Pauline looked at the board. Her white king was in a difficult position, and the black queen and knight were threateningly frozen in attack. "If I lose, what will happen to me?" she asked, trying not to show her fear. "Your footsteps will be silenced," the man replied, "and your shadow will remain here forever." Suddenly the board lit up again, showing new images. Pauline saw other people playing behind it, men and women from different eras. Each of them made their moves, but only a few completed the game. She noticed that those who were losing disappeared, leaving only faint shadows behind them, and those who were winning were leaving, but with empty eyes, as if giving up a part of themselves. "It's a trap," she shouted, turning to the man. He nodded, but there was no gloating or compassion in his eyes. "Every game is a trap, but only here can you find the truth." Pauline sat back down at the blackboard. Her fingers trembled as she touched a piece. She analyzed the position. The only way to save the king was to sacrifice the rook. "You won't make it in time. Make a move," the man hurried her. Collecting herself, she moved her rook. The black queen immediately attacked her, destroying her piece. "Why do I have to do this? Why can't you let me go?" Pauline shouted. "You came here on your own," replied the man. "The board does not call anyone who does not want to know the truth." "What truth?" The man answered nothing, but pointed to the board. Her last move led to a position where checkmate was inevitable. The black king was in the corner, and the white pawn was suddenly given away to turn into a queen. Pauline raised her pawn, ready to make her last move. "Are you sure?" the man asked. "I have no choice," she replied. When the pawn touched the cage, the light around it flashed so brightly that Polina closed her eyes. When Pauline woke up, she realized that she was sitting alone in her room. The chessboard was closed and the pieces were in their places, as if nothing had happened. But something was wrong. The floors no longer creaked, even when she walked, and her reflection in the mirror looked back at her with a delay, as if it had moved late. She realized she had one, but a part of her remained on that board. Now Paulina lives in a house where no one hears the creaking floorboards anymore, but every night she looks at the chessboard, realizing that the game is not over. Pauline tried to forget that terrible night. The chessboard was closed again and hidden in the far corner of the closet, but the memories of the strange game did not leave her alone. Her reflection in the mirror still moved with a slight delay, and quiet whispers occasionally echoed in the silence of the night. But what frightened Pauline most of all was the complete absence of the creaking of the floorboards. On the third night after the game, she awoke again at 3 o'clock in the morning. This time she was awakened not by a creak, but by a new sound, a light tapping, as if her fingers were touching the glass. She jumped up and turned on the light. The sound was coming from the living room. Pauline picked up her phone and slowly made her way there. When she entered, she saw the chessboard lying on the table, though she remembered exactly that she had put it away. The lid was ajar again, and the pieces were arranged in their starting position. No, I finished the game," she whispered, feeling fear clutching her chest. A whisper came from the corner of the room. "You've only just begun." Pauline turned around, but saw no one. Her gaze, however, stopped at the mirror. This time the reflection moved differently. It looked directly at her, without repeating her actions. "Who are you?" she shouted, backing away from the wall. The reflection took a step forward. It was no longer copying her movements, but living a life of its own. "I am you, the one left on the board," it said. At that moment, the reflection reached out to the glass, and waves rippled on its surface, as if the mirror were liquid. "You got your balance back, but the payment wasn't complete. Now you're bound to the shadows. You thought the game was over, but the board keeps choosing." Pauline felt cold fingers invisibly touch her hand, and a faint imprint of a chess piece appeared on her palm. It was a black king. "What does it mean?" she asked fearfully. "It's your seal," the reflection replied. "You are no longer just a player. You are part of the board." Suddenly the chessboard began to make a quiet, monotonous sound. Pauline came closer and saw that the pieces began to move by themselves. The white pawn made the first move. "What should I do?" she asked, feeling despair overwhelm her. The reflection in the mirror smiled. "You know what to do. If you don't answer, the board will choose a new target." Pauline realized the game wasn't over, and now she was part of it. Every move she made affected not only her fate, but the world around her. Taking a deep breath, she sat down at the board and moved a piece. The moment her fingers touched the pawn, the lights in the room went out, and a thick, dark shadow began to pour out of the mirror. The darkness that poured out of the mirror began to fill the room, moving like thick smoke. Pauline recoiled, but the chessboard remained in front of her, as if drawing her back. Silhouettes loomed out of the shadows, tall, elongated, with absent faces. They surrounded the table without making a sound, and their figures seemed part of the darkness itself. "You made a move," one of the shadows said in a voice that sounded more like a whisper of wind. "Now your shadow is playing with us." Pauline looked at the board. The white pawn moved forward, and the black piece began to move in response. "What do you want me to do? Why should I do this?" she shouted, but her voice echoed through the room. "You are a link player," said the other silhouette. "When you play, time moves. When you stop, it stands still." Pauline felt cold fingers slip on her shoulder. She turned around and saw her reflection in the mirror, which was now looking back at her from the very shadows. "You don't realize what you've done," it whispered. "This board isn't just a game. It's a door between worlds." "What worlds?" Pauline asked, feeling panic rising inside her. "Between ours and theirs," the reflection answered, nodding toward the shadows. "They come through the chessboard. Each game is a ritual. Each loser is their new shadow." Pauline clenched her hands into fists. "I don't want to be a part of this. Give me my life back." One of the shadows stretched out towards her. "Then you must complete the game. If you win, the link is broken. If you lose, you stay with us." The chessboard began to make a quiet scraping sound again. The black pieces moved, and Pauline's king was in danger. Her hands trembled. Every move seemed final, but she knew, if she gave up, the shadows would take her forever. "You made a move," one of the shadows said in a voice that sounded more like a whisper of wind. "Now your shadow is playing with us." Pauline looked at the board. The white pawn moved forward, and the black piece began to move in response. "What do you want me to do? Why should I do this?" she shouted, but her voice echoed through the room. "You are a link player," said the other silhouette. "When you play, time moves. When you stop, it stands still." Pauline felt cold fingers slip on her shoulder. She turned around and saw her reflection in the mirror, which was now looking back at her from the very shadows. "You don't realize what you've done," it whispered. "This board isn't just a game. It's a door between worlds." "What worlds?" Pauline asked, feeling panic rising inside her. "Between ours and theirs," the reflection answered, nodding toward the shadows. "They come through the chessboard. Each game is a ritual. Each loser is their new shadow." Pauline clenched her hands into fists. "I don't want to be a part of this. Give me my life back." One of the shadows stretched out towards her. "Then you must complete the game. If you win, the link is broken. If you lose, you stay with us." The chessboard began to make a quiet scraping sound again. The black pieces moved, and Pauline's king was in danger. Her hands trembled. Every move seemed final, but she knew if she gave up, the shadows would take her forever.